Ramsay Bolton, Ramsay Snow, Ramsay Flayman, Ramsay... no. The most villainous of characters from Game of Thrones, and possibly the most villainous in the books. Ramsay Bolton is the illegitimate son of Roose Bolton of the Dreadfort. He is a brutal, sadistic figure that I've been getting requests to make a video about ever since I first started discussing Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire characters, but I've always hesitated because you don't really get that much evidence about Ramsay in the books or the show. I felt there wasn't a great deal we learn about him that could inform a really in-depth character analysis. And to an extent that's true. You'll see that this video. There are gaps in our knowledge about Ramsay which leave space open either for me to speculate loosely or to ask for your thoughts in the comments. Ramsay has no point of view chapters in the books. The closest we get are from Thejon, but there's a limit to what anybody reveals about him. But then I was thinking about Reek as a character the other day, and I started reflecting and then rereading some chapters and extracts, and yeah, even if our knowledge is limited, and even if there is going to be a bit more speculation than I usually like to make, there's still a lot we can say based on what we do know. So watch a train move across some water, and then we're going to have a big discussion about the childhood of Ramsay Snow, okay? Just quickly to jump in while I'm editing, by the way, I found out this morning that the channel Vile Eye made a character analysis of Ramsay Bolton just 2 weeks ago, which either makes this video bad timing or brilliant timing, I don't know. I do know, however, that a load of you will be asking me in the comments about it, so yes, I just watched their video this morning. Thankfully we make different points for a lot of this. I've not really watched many of their videos before, but I thought it was good, I'd recommend it, and I think their suggestion that Ramsay could be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder is a plausible diagnosis to suggest. Now, childhood. For those of you that haven't read the books, a lot of this will be new information, so we'll go through it together. Roose Bolton is the Lord of the Dreadfort, and one day essentially came across Ramsay's mother, the wife of a miller. There is an archaic and technically banned tradition in Westeros. I say technically banned because Roose Bolton suggests he and some of the other lords secretly practice it, but the law of the First Night, where a lord has the right to basically inflict SA on the bride during their wedding night. The miller and his wife had married without informing their lord of the wedding because, you know, it's an old, dead, banned tradition anyway. But in punishment for not being informed, Roose hanged the husband from a tree and inflicted SA on the wife right beneath his hanging body, which is just awful. And again, to make it clear, this tradition wasn't practiced anymore. Roose probably just wanted this woman and used the law of First Night as a thin excuse. That was how Ramsay was conceived, and whether or not he knew this story when he was young, it's still likely to have had a massive impact on him as a person when you stop to consider, well, what state of mind would his mother have been in raising Ramsay? Raising him entirely on her own at first, it seems. She had been through the trauma of SA, as well as her husband being murdered and left with the perpetrator's baby growing inside her. We have no idea what his mother actually thought or felt, because everybody does feel differently in different circumstances. However, it is entirely possible she resented Ramsay, or perhaps even feared this child, either more literally fearing he would grow into the same kind of horror that Roose Bolton is, or less consciously, Ramsay is this ever-present reminder of her trauma. Might that make it difficult to feel in a calm, warm, loving frame of mind around him? Might that leave the mother anxious, panicked, angered, sad around Ramsay, to want to look on this innocent child with love, and yet when she looks into his eyes, seeing only Roose's eyes and being unable to hide the distress in her own expression? Maybe. This is just speculation that could line up with what we know of adult Ramsay. Babies and infants learn so much about who they are, how they feel about themselves, based on the way their caregivers feel about them, treat them. So what if Ramsay's primary experiences with his mother was seeing her afraid, seeing her resentful or upset? what might such an infant start to think and feel about themselves, often on a much deeper, less conscious level than he might even understand. The mother, whose name we don't even know, she might have managed these feelings incredibly well, but it's also not at all easy for a person to tolerate this constant reminder of her trauma, let alone actively engage with it, love it, show affection towards it. This thing of Roose Bolton with those same cold eyes. If there's anything constantly described about Roose Bolton, it's how very chilling his eyes are. You know, I 100% do not believe children are born evil, not even if you subscribe to the theory that Roose Bolton is actually some sort of skin-stealing monster. However, when an infant grows up with 90% of his experiences being a mother that looks upon him like he is evil, as though he is a monster, as though he is unlovable, what is that infant going to conclude about himself? It's possible this would cause the child to grow up eager to prove that idea wrong, to show the world I can be good, and to try very, very hard to be so, but it's incredibly hard to do that when you don't actually feel it deep down about yourself. You need a level of hope and belief in yourself to find that motivation, but if you're made to feel enough like it's hopeless, pointless, that you're irreparably evil, then fighting against that can start to feel near impossible. Easier then to embrace it than to fight it. Make it your armour, in the words of Tyrion. Revel in just how much you can terrorise people. But there's a less speculative point to make within this. It's to theorise that Ramsay might have suffered neglect. In a medieval world where neglect wasn't understood, where he's raised by a single mother on her own who was also trying to manage a mill, who was also probably in a state of grief and possible depression about her SA and the murder of her husband, and also may not have felt much warmth towards Ramsay anyway, in the context of all of that, neglect seems highly likely, both a neglect of attention and care towards Ramsay, but also the emotional neglect of much love and warmth and physical touch. I recently discussed in a different video some of the effects neglect can have on a child, particularly during their first 3 years of life. These are the formulative years where the brain is making its most connections. The experiences you have during that period can be massive in terms of your development. And so the fact we see Ramsay as a man clearly lacking in empathy, among other things, with what we know of his childhood, neglect seems like it may have played a hand in that. How does any child learn to feel love and empathy towards others if they never experience anyone feeling it towards them? Never learn what empathy feels like, never experience those connections and attachments to other people. The brain needs to develop over time, and without enough of the right experiences at the right time, it's not going to do that properly. I know that's quite a straightforward point to make about Ramsay, but it is a crucial one. Neglect is incredibly damaging to an infant, and as two side notes here, one, genetics may have had some effects too. Knowing Roose Bolton is a similarly cold figure despite Ramsay not meeting him at all during his childhood really. There are certain predispositions genetics might leave you with, but obviously we can't know for sure about Ramsay. Yes, people often comment about me not mentioning genetics enough. The main reason I don't mention them much is because that's kind of all you can say. It might have had an effect. And two, I know a lot of you in the past have rolled your eyes when I talk about trauma in this story, and you say these books aren't set in 2023, this is the medieval period where people experienced SA, witnessed murder, killing, torture all the time. Everything was horrific and people were used to that. It was accepted as ordinary, which to an extent, yes, that probably does have some effect, but it doesn't suddenly mean trauma didn't exist at all, and that people didn't ever experience it. Trauma wasn't suddenly invented in the 21st century. And secondly, these are fictional books written by a modern man who is very aware of mental health issues and writes his characters within that modern awareness. I think to discount the effects trauma might have had on any person in any period of time, but especially so on these characters invented by someone from our world, that would be reductive. There's more to discuss about Ramsay's childhood though, and I think this is where we turn the attention a little bit more towards Roose Bolton. But before then, let me divert your attention for about 90 seconds.
Tell me what you see.
Nothing.
Not nothing.
Well, Anvil,
400 miles that way. 300 miles that way. 700, 400, 300, 700 that way.
World Anvil is a really cool thing, and they're still sponsoring me till death do us part. Listen to me passionately talk about them. World Anvil is an online tool for world building, the anviling of worlds, character creation, campaign building, story planning, and even writing, and a load more stuff that can be great for anyone with creative projects or games. I use it for the planning of my novel. My organisation is chaotic, so World Anvil really helps. I love the way you can create timelines of events with hyperlinks from those pages to a character bio or some other event or information or whatever. Like, my memory isn't the best for the minor details of stuff I invent, so when I'm reading back information about the history of my novel's world and I think, who is this person? I can only half remember. Or what order did these events happen in? Why did that become a social custom? Whatever. I can very easily click a hyperlink to a different page I wrote and check. The ability to create entire timelines based on your own invented calendars and be able to link everything to it, including changes in the maps for if a city gets destroyed or something like that, that is so damn cool. And there are other tools too. Not all of them are ones I need for my novel personally, but they all still look really handy, and I've always found everything pretty easy to use. If it's your thing, they also have a Discord and they run all sorts of events and community support and stuff, like this summer camp they've been running. It's all really great and I enjoy getting to promote them. So there is a link in the description and there's a pinned comment that entitles you to 51% off. Yep, it's 51 now. All their subscriptions with the code TREE. If you want to try it out first, they have a free version so you can get familiar, you know, take your time, take it out for a nice dinner and see where things lead. Yeah, World Anvil. A year after Ramsay's birth, his mother took him to the Dreadfort to show Roose Bolton and effectively say that the brother of her deceased husband had stolen the meal from her and kicked her out. Could Lord Bolton help with that? And Roose Bolton himself tells Thejon about this. I should have had the mother whipped and thrown her child down a well, but the babe did have my eyes. This fact stayed his hand. In the show, they changed the implication of this story to suggest he felt a level of care towards his son.
I nearly had her whipped, and the child thrown in the river. But then I looked at you, and I saw then what I see now. You are my son.
Although that could just be manipulation, but in the books it's less that he cares for his son than the fact kinslaying is regarded as a mortal sin for which a person might be cursed. That stayed his hand. And then upon hearing that the husband's brother beat the mum and cast her out specifically because he saw Ramsay's eyes similar to Roose's, that seems to injure his pride. That annoyed me. So I gave her the mill and had her brother's tongue cut out to make certain he did not go running to Winterfell with tales that might disturb Lord Rickard. Each year I sent the woman some piglets and chickens and a bag of stars, on the understanding that she was never to tell the boy who had fathered him. So what we have is a situation where the mother somewhat depends on Ramsay for her livelihood. If, and this is just speculation, but if she felt a level of resentment towards Ramsay, she now also somewhat depends on him in order to receive those chickens, piglets, and a degree of protection. Ramsay's nobility, if that's the word you'd use, his illegitimate claim, that suddenly becomes incredibly important to her, and could then become one thing she might like about her son. Or at least the one thing he might gradually learn makes his mum care. That's one very tenuous suggestion, even I have to say. What is a less tenuous suggestion here is that once Ramsay is legitimised as a Bolton in the eyes of the great King Tommen Baratheon, Ramsay does not then like to be reminded of his bastardy. When one man accidentally calls him Lord Snow instead of Lord Bolton, he is immediately killed for it. Many others face wrath. Now, we don't know what age Ramsay found out who his father was, nor who told him. However, every year his mum gets this Amazon delivery of chickens and piglets and whatever are stars from some mysterious person who clearly has a great deal of wealth. She also much later gets given a servant named Reek, the original Reek. Yes, we'll come to him in a moment if you're not familiar with the books. A servant that had once been one of Lord Bolton's suddenly becomes hers to help look after an increasingly wild and unruly Ramsay. Ramsay would then probably have put two and two together at some point if he wasn't already told. Lord Bolton is my dad. So let's try going through this now. You have a child who presumably didn't know who his father was to begin with, but knew that there was one who kept Ramsay at a distance, who clearly didn't want to see him or have him around. Here is a child who has to do something with that information. Is it more fuel to the belief that he is some unlovable monster? Perhaps, but that's unlikely to be a fact you want to dwell on. Does he then conclude his mother drove her dad away? It's her fault. Possibly. You could potentially make a link that says Ramsay treats women similarly to the way Roose treated Ramsay's mother. Perhaps, but we don't really know what Ramsay thinks about his mum, beyond Thejon recounting that Ramsay told him, "You met his mother whilst out riding, and were smitten by her beauty." Smitten? Bolton laughed. Did he use that word? Why, the boy is a singer's soul, though if you believe that song, you may well be dimmer than the first Reek. Even by an age that Ramsay has clearly been told firsthand how little Roose thought of his mother. Told exactly the story of his conception, Ramsay is still keen to try and envision a level of romance between his parents, which I think would firstly suggest he himself doesn't look on his mum like some lowly object to discard, but also that he wants to imagine that Roose cared. You know, if he wants to believe this as an adult, he probably also believed it as a child, that Roose cared for his mother and for him. He must do. He keeps sending chickens and piglets. The reason he doesn't visit isn't because he doesn't care, it must be something else, some other reason, but what? And then Ramsay finds out his dad is Lord of the Dreadfort, and there you have a convincing argument to make. My dad does care, he does love us, he just can't visit because it's not the proper thing for a lord to do. We are commoners here. Again, the fact adult Ramsay still half wants to believe that their meeting was romantic suggests this might have been a conclusion he has long tried to convince himself of. And it's an argument that would offer him some hope as well. The only reason my dad never visits is because it's not proper when he is highborn and we are common. Therefore, all I need to do is to raise myself to a highborn status. Then he will care, then he will notice me, approve of me. Nobility will change everything. What we end up with is a child that over-identifies with this absent, unknown father, and also pinning a great deal of hope on getting approval from him. My mum doesn't offer me much, maybe, we don't know that for certain, but if she doesn't, maybe my dad will. I can't help wonder if Ramsay's obsession for flaying his victims comes into this. The Bolton sigil is, after all, a flayed man. Ramsay, not really knowing anything about his dad, but finding out he is Lord Bolton, might see that and be keen to identify with it in a very grisly version of trying to be like his dad. And of course, Roose Bolton does flay people too. Ramsay might learn that and consequently flay people to the extreme, seeking approval and identification obviously isn't the only reason for him to commit such unthinkably horrific torture, but it is one possibility at least worth mentioning here. Either way, do we end up with a child very, very eager to live up to his slight claim, to become legitimised, marrying that idea with fatherly approval, making that his main goal in life? Obviously becoming legitimate would also afford him power, so that too, but I think it may contribute to a level of splitting here. Be like his dad, not like his mum. He's the nobility I need to strive to, she's the reminder that I'm a bastard, that I was raised as a commoner, that I don't know any of the lordly customs and rules, identify with the dad, not with the mum. And yeah, as I also said just there, Ramsay was not raised like a lord, so even when he does eventually come to live in a Dreadfort and act as a lord's son, he is still very much a fish out of water in this world of highborn expectations for how to be a proper lord. Therefore, any reminder that he isn't one, I think, becomes doubly painful because he may already feel like he's not living up to that. And then of course, Ramsay never does win his father's approval, not even once he's legitimised, partly because Roose Bolton is just not a loving man, and partly because it gives Roose power over him to deny any praise and affection. That's a big part of how he keeps control over Ramsay. All you have, I gave you. You would do well to remember that, bastard. Should Ramsay realise he's never going to get that approval regardless of anything, however, would that then turn the tables? Would he suddenly seek revenge? I said I'd talk about Reek though, the original Reek first, so let's do that now. So as mentioned, when Ramsay was starting to become wild and unruly, in Roos's words, his mother comes to visit him again and asks for his help with this, so Roos gives her Reek, a servant who is named that because he quite literally stinks, despite the fact the man would wash 3 times a day and put flowers in his hair. The smell was something he was born with. A curse, the small folk said. The gods made him stink so that men would know his soul was rotting. My old maester insisted it was a sign of sickness, yet the boy was otherwise as strong as a young bull. No one could stand to be near him, so he slept with the pigs. Bruce gave her this man as an amusing joke. Amusing to him, he thinks so little of his bastard son that he sends a man literally named Reek, not anyone befitting of a little lord. Firstly, there are several real-world illnesses, as far as I understand, that might cause a person to smell. I suppose it would have to be particularly bad for small folk in the world where they rarely wash themselves to find Reek so unpleasant, but to spend his whole life being told the gods made him stink to let people know his soul was rotting, to be told he was that bad a person, and to literally have to sleep with pigs because no one can stand him. From what we're told, Reek is a bitter, vindictive man, and Roos isn't sure which one corrupted the other in his words, Reek corrupting Ramsay or Ramsay corrupting Reek, which is a hypocritical thing for a man who literally inflicted SA on a woman whilst hanging her husband on a tree above them. He's hardly a pure being. Roos almost certainly spends a lot of his time projecting down onto Ramsay, but the point is, we could loosely hypothesize here that Reek may have lived the sort of life that could turn a person bitter and vindictive, therefore making him a bad role model for this child Ramsay. And B, if Reek was meant to be an amusing jape, that's not how it was taken. He and Ramsay instead became inseparable, and, you know, of course they did. Ramsay wants to be closer to his very distant dad. His dad sends him this servant. Jape or not, it clearly shows some faint level of care. That's what Ramsay might hope. Reek is some faint connection to his father, someone from the Dreadfort, some link to the life that he desperately wants to have. Of course he becomes close to Reek. Well, not of course, because Ramsay isn't exactly known for close relationships to anyone, but Reek does seem close to some extent. Probably not healthy or full of affection, but a relationship nonetheless. And hypothesizing again, Ramsay would hardly want to think, my dad cares so little that he sends a man the world looks on as subhuman to care for me. He doesn't want to think that, but he also can't exactly pretend Reek is some sophisticated, respectable figure that represents highborn life. His name is Reek, it rhymes with freak, so how else can he interpret this? This is the bit where I have to make a big leap of conjecture, okay? Feel free to disagree, because this is far more me joining up dots based on other things we know than a sensible conclusion to jump to in its own right. All the same, the fact Reek is so lowly, that fact wouldn't reflect so badly on Ramsay if you saw Reek more like a loyal dog than an actual servant. Because lords often do have loyal dogs, and they are beastly, and they do tend to smell bad, but that's an acceptable thing, right? That's what dogs are like. What if Ramsay then looked on Reek like a loyal dog his father had sent him as a symbol of care, rather than as a lowly man sent as a symbol of his lack of care? It's a hell of a leap of conjecture, but it does make some sense within the context of Ramsay's life. In fact, let's devote a whole section to dogs. We'll come back to Reek in a moment, okay? Ramsay has an interest in hounds. He often treats Thejon like one. He often goes hunting with his dogs. Except it's even worse than ordinary hunting. He lets innocent women go running free so he and his hounds can hunt them down. If they provide good sports, I think the term is, then he will end their life quickly and name his next litter of dogs after them. The women, in Ramsay's eyes, somewhat then reincarnated as his dogs, transformed into dogs, which is very fitting when we see him largely transforming Thejon into one, to the extent he eventually ends up sleeping in the kennels with the hounds. That's what he does if they're good sports. If they're bad, their death is even more horrible. But in that behaviour, Ramsay seems to to think there's a sick sort of honour in becoming one of his dogs. Obviously it's also a degrading act, but this does seem to be a repeating theme in Ramsay's life, treating people like dogs, turning them into dogs, making that his relationship to them, as a lord to his hounds. When Ramsay marries Jane Paul, he doesn't marry Sansa in the books by the way, he marries Sansa's old friend, who is disguised and called Arya Stark in order to trick the other northern houses into thinking he's marrying a Stark, into having a claim to Winterfell. After marrying her, and as well as a wide variety of treatment we don't need to mention, it is implied Ramsay made Jane Paul perform sexual acts with his dogs, also forcing Theon to do the same with her. I'm not going to discuss any of that further, it's just further evidence for this side of Ramsay to do with dogs. The fact is, a dog is beneath Ramsay. It's the archetypal animal that you have beneath you. The human is its master, the dog is below it, and we know Ramsay desperately needs figures to project down onto. Others for him to make feel like beastly, lesser beings instead of him, who may have felt worthless in the eyes of his mother, and certainly felt lesser and lower in comparison to his dad due to his bastardy. If I want to feel more lordly when deep down a part of me feels lesser, then I have to project the unlordly aspects elsewhere. So I think making other people seem like dogs is his way to project and mitigate the fact the nobility might look at him that way. The fact it's so degrading is definitely also a part of the appeal for him here, and how much more powerful that might make him feel in contrast to his victims, that no doubt compensates for any feelings of inferiority. And, as I've also suggested, what are dogs known for? What is their iconic character trait? It's loyalty. Animals who will serve you no matter how you treat them. And for a boy who never felt much love and affection from others, loyalty might be the best he can hope for. Put it this way, I don't think Ramsay trusts any of his servants or squires or the men in his employ. Which is unsurprising, they are Roos's men that Roos even suggests spy for Roos on Ramsay. Ramsay literally doesn't have any friends he can trust, but also internally he might not believe deep down he is worthy of them anyway. And so if he can't trust people ordinarily, if forming bonds where people love him, if that feels like an impossible goal and hopeless, then he needs to instead make them loyal. How do you make them loyal if they won't love you? You make them like a dog. And when this process also affords him a means to satisfy his sadistic pleasures that can probably be tied to a total lack of empathy, and B, as we have already mentioned, degrading others as a way to project down his own feelings of being lesser, and C, perhaps this over-identifying with his father whose sigil is a flayed man. So I think we can say all of that, and again, if viewing this strange first Reek like a loyal dog rather than a human servant, if that made this cruel jape of being Reek seem less of a jape to Ramsay and more acceptable, did Reek then inform Ramsay's interest in dogs? Reek was Ramsay's one close relationship, so is all of this other behaviour with dogs an attempt to emulate what he had with the first Reek? Maybe? Well, let's get back to Reek again. It would appear Ramsay always treated Reek as subservient to him. I don't find that too surprising when Reek was literally sent to them as a servant and was very much named Reek, setting him up as someone lesser. Plus, Ramsay is very keen to identify with his father and see himself as lordly, so the opportunity to order someone around might have jumped at him anyway, even if he wasn't already so keen to project and wasn't so sadistic. I even think the fact his mother found him wild and unruly tells us how difficult it would have been to support this child. Zero experiences to help regulate his emotions, which we see is something adult Ramsay very much struggles to do. I don't know if Ramsay cared about Reek. I don't know if care would be the right word for it, but it would seem Reek was a little closer to Ramsay's equal than the Theon version was as the second Reek. You know, no real mention is made of him torturing the original Reek, for example. Not that means it didn't happen, but still. There's also the fact Reek was allowed to take part in a lot of Ramsay's cruelty, something it would appear he wanted to do. We know before Ramsay was captured by the Stark forces of Roderick Cassell, or rather when he was about to be captured, Reek was committing SA on a peasant girl Ramsay had given him. Admittedly, Ramsay then switched clothes with Reek and orders Reek to ride away dressed as him so that Reek gets captured and executed by Roderick's forces. They mistake Reek for Ramsay and execute him instead, whilst the real Ramsay is able to live on. He is quite happy to let Reek die when it became necessary. But I suppose we could say Ramsay felt a level of possessiveness towards Reek. He and later Thejon are always described as his Reek, my Reek. We know Reek meant something important from the fact Ramsay literally creates a new Reek at the first available opportunity. His old one dies, he then makes Thejon into Reek instead. That's something you don't really get in the show where the original Reek doesn't exist. It simply feels like a name he gives Thejon in order to emphasise how lowly Thejon is. However, in the books it's because he misses his original Reek, effectively. He wants that again. This loyal dog that isn't Roos's and has always been there. I don't know if this is correct or appropriate, this might just be me, but when I think of Ramsay and Reek and trying to create a new Reek, I have this nightmarish image of a boy wanting a teddy bear as this transitional object to take with him. It's a weird thought that. But after all, his father did send him Reek. It was the one and only thing his father did send him. It might have felt like care to Ramsay at the time, like affection. Reek might have come to symbolise that to Ramsay. Therefore, he wants that symbol of care again, possessing Reek as this warped, imagined symbol of his father's affection. But yeah, Ramsay is very possessive of Thejon as his Reek. He hates it when Roose wants to take Thejon for a little while. His reaction is to argue with his dad until he realises that won't work. Then he turns to Thejon. I'll have you back, no matter what that Dustin bitch may tell you. Who are you? Reek, my lord. Your man. I'm Reek. It rhymes with sneak. It does. And my father brings you back, I'm going to take another finger. I'll let you choose which one. Moments like this tell us a lot about how terribly Ramsay fears rejection, and how desperate he is for this loyalty that the dog becomes a symbol for. He repeatedly asks Thejon who he is, not just to degrade him, but for Thejon to reassure him, I am your man, your Reek. We see him here literally threatening to punish Thejon for betrayal, so pained by the mere idea of rejection that Thejon is going to be punished even though it's not his fault and he doesn't want to go with Roose, just the mere idea of Thejon going with Roose for a bit that makes Ramsay feel betrayed. It's in the context of all of this, as much as I do have problems with Ramsay's demise in the show, it is then very fitting that Sansa unleashes his own hounds on him, where Ramsay tells her his dogs are loyal to him, they won't harm him, only he then learns exactly what a starving dog will do. Ramsay might demand and try to force Thejon into absolute servitude and loyalty, but he'll only have that so long as Theon's fear outweighs his hope. When Theon eventually finds his chance, he does betray Ramsay, and, you know, genuinely, I actually think that would feel devastating to him. Let's move on now, okay? This section is going to jump back and forth between a few different points in a haphazard manner, but first we need to explain to non-book readers how Ramsay captures Thejon, because it is a bit different in the books. It starts when, during Robb Stark's war against the Lannisters, the Lord of the Northern House Hornwood dies in battle. Coincidentally dying in a battle Roose Bolton also took part in, but never mind that. Lady Danella Hornwood now inherits the land, but she is a widow, so Ramsay rides up with a host while she's travelling on the road and he intercepts her. He forces her to marry him at sword point, giving him claim to the Hornwood lands, and then he locks her in a castle where it's said she eats her fingers, either out of starvation or more likely the fingers being flayed to the point that eating them would be less painful. This is an awful event to have happened. The Northern Lords are appalled. Roose Bolton has to adamantly insist he had no part in it. He is equally appalled by his illegitimate son's actions. This is Ramsay being a lowly beast. Bruce is quite happy for the Northern Lords to capture and execute Ramsay as punishment. So Roderick Cassell rides up with a host. Ramsay switches clothes with Reek, as already mentioned, and so Reek gets executed, where Ramsay instead, disguised as Reek, is now imprisoned in Winterfell to be kept alive as a possible witness to Ramsay's crimes. And then Theon invades Winterfell. He takes over the castle, but there aren't many people Theon captures that are willing to serve him in Winterfell, except for this man, Reek. He offers to serve Theon. He swears an oath to House Greyjoy, and for a brief section of the story, there is a really interesting role reversal. Ramsay himself has become Reek, serving Prince Theon above him, instead of it being the other way around. That's interesting, right? You wouldn't have thought a man who loses his temper at being called Lord Snow, or being reminded of his bastard roots, that he would want to take on that role of the very lowly servant named Reek, the one he has spent so much of his life projecting onto. Well, technically it's a little bit different, because Ramsay knows he's only masquerading here, only pretending at being Reek, biding his time to reverse the roles again and turn Theon into that. So that does change things slightly, yes. We also know deceit is Ramsay's strength. Deceit and outlandish brutality are the only two things he has going for him, and the only things that have afforded him any semblance of power. But I also think it again tells us how very much Reek is tied to Ramsay's identity. It's not just a symbol of loyalty, it's also a part of him, not entirely separate. No wonder he keeps wanting Reek around. Am I suggesting Ramsay has multiple personality disorder? No, not really. Am I suggesting his sense of self is somewhat split here? One part the Lord Bolton, the noble, the part that identifies with his father and tries to emulate the highborn life he can't quite understand, and the other part Reek, the bastard, the part that identifies with his mother. Ramsay is caught between these two, and in that sense playing Reek for a little while, I don't know, maybe it kind of feels familiar. Either way, he poses as Reek, earns Theon's trust, then tells Theon he'd be able to ride back to the Dreadfort and assemble Bolton troops to come and help Theon defend Winterfell. So off he goes, he gets a load of troops, massacres Roderick's men with them, and when Theon opens the gates in gratitude to him, Winterfell is sacked and Theon imprisoned. The other thing we can explore with this long story about Lady Hornwood and capturing Theon is Ramsay's approach to politics. He seems very impulsive, much less politically astute to play the long game than his father is. I've already suggested that he struggles regulating his emotions. You know, there's a chance to gain the Hornwood lands. Ramsay charges in and forcibly marries her, not considering how the other lords might respond, and also almost getting himself killed as a result. Ramsay is impulsive. On several occasions, Roose has to tell him to rein in his impulse. One of his biggest mistakes is that he can't help but beat and SA Jane Paul, the fake Arya Stark, whilst the other Northern Lords are still in the same castle. You know, they hear her tears, Ned's little girl, and it makes them want revenge against the Boltons. And yet, at the same time, I don't think Ramsay is quite as impulsive as people often suggest. Because, for the most, he does rein in his impulses. He struggles to, but he is almost always courteous and polite to other lords. He never quite loses his temper with his father, and whilst he does impulsively murder a commoner calling him Lord Snow instead of Lord Bolton, that's also because there are no repercussions for murdering this commoner. He sees no reason to be reining in his impulses there. Plus, the whole section of the story around his marriage to Jane Paul and leading up to it, that is all a very stressful period for Ramsay, wrought with failure and threats, and the Boltons are increasingly teetering on the edge of demise. So I do think this stress makes him more likely to be impulsive and reckless than he has been in the past. That's not to say he isn't impulsive, but I just think it's quite a bit less extreme, and in that light I don't think marrying Lady Hornwood was an impulsive decision of his. Personally, I'm of the opinion Roose Bolton played a hand in planning it, merely pretending to be appalled by this event. The evidence is admittedly quite weak, but it would illustrate a dynamic in which Roose Bolton treats Ramsay a bit like an expendable pawn to inflict brutality that Roose can then wash his hands on and pretend that he didn't endorse. Kind of like Tywin does with Sir Gregor, who is a character also linked to the idea of dogs actually. Both as his house sigil and as Tywin treating Sir Gregor like a hound to unleash. I wouldn't be surprised if Ramsay is a little like that to Roose, but Ramsay also isn't entirely expendable either. He's Roose's only heir after his legitimate son Domeric mysteriously died of illness. A sickness of the bowels, Maester Uther says, but I say poison. It's entirely possible that Ramsay murdered Domeric Bolton. I think we can understand why. It's afforded Ramsay a chance to be elevated, and it also shows his envy turning into impulsive rage. Domeric might feel like an obstacle to the approval that Ramsay craves. Although I don't think that necessarily means he did kill Domeric. Poison hasn't seemed Ramsay's style, the Maester didn't think he was killed. People die all the time of illness. It's only Roose who suspects Ramsay poisoned him, but that's also probably what Roose would suspect anyway. When you hear the, maybe not affection, but definitely at least pride, with which Roose tells even Theon about his son Domeric. He served 4 years as Lady Dustin's page, and 3 in the Vale as squires to Lord Redford. He played the high harp, read histories, and rode like the wind. Horses. The boy was mad for horses, Lady Dustin will tell you. Not even Lord Rickard's daughter could outrace him, and that one was half horse herself. Redford said he showed great promise in the lists. A great jouster must be a great horseman first. That is an oddly human, albeit very, very faint trace of emotion from Roose there. He looks on Domeric with pride, then he looks at Ramsay, a boy who is none of those things, was never a page, does not play the high harp and read histories. Whilst Ramsay can ride It's Not Like the Wind, Ramsay is mad for dogs, not horses. He looks on Domeric, then he looks at his only other son Ramsay, and that so common fantasy of I wish the other child had died instead, is perhaps a fantasy that feeds the suspicion, what if that is why Domeric did die? Ramsay obviously has motive and is ruthless enough, so it is what Roose would likely conclude regardless. Again, that's not to say Ramsay didn't murder Domeric, and possibly Roose's other children as well, it's just to say that we can't be sure. So, there you go, an unusual moment of me choosing not to speculate in a video rife with speculation. Let's discuss Theon, Jane, and Jon briefly now. This section will be very short, I just had these quick thoughts and wanted to put them somewhere. Theon was a seemingly arrogant prince taken in by Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North. Despite Theon having never known Eddard growing up, he was raised by him like an actual son. Whereas Ramsay, who never knew his own father figure in Roose, was not taken in and raised like an actual son. He was only taken in much later out of necessity, so Ramsay, already envious of highborn status, might see arrogant young Prince Theon as an obvious target for resentment. Why did Theon get such affection from his distant northern father figure? I think in the context of all Ramsay's actions, it is at least worth mentioning what Theon specifically might mean to him. And similarly, Jane Paul is an interesting one because marrying her under the guise of Jane actually being Arya Stark, heir to Winterfell now that Sansa is missing. Jane affords him a level of legitimacy, or respectability, or at least lukewarm acceptance from the other Northern Lords that he previously lacked. He somewhat depends on her for that, and Ramsay doesn't like being dependent. But more so, she is not Arya, and I'm fairly certain Ramsay knows that. Therefore, she is also a reminder that he isn't actually legitimate in his claim to Winterfell. She is a reminder that Ramsay is not all of the things he keeps trying to convince himself that he is. And Jon is a bastard like Ramsay and sort of an opposite to him throughout the story. Jon is not legitimized, affording Ramsay space to project onto him, hence the venom with which Ramsay keeps calling Jon bastard in the Pink Letter. And yes, it's unlikely Ramsay did actually write that letter, but it was written by someone who knew how Ramsay speaks. John is both that and also someone who, again, was given all the approval and acceptance from his father figure that Ramsay never got. He was raised not as a lord, but like a lord, taught all of the customs, taught how to fight and ride and handle politics, whereas Ramsay learnt none of those things. Roose suggests that Ramsay wields a sword like a butcher rather than a knight. In title, Ramsay becomes everything John wanted to be. The pink letter is signed Ramsay Bolton, Trueborn Lord of Winterfell, the very thing John used to dream of becoming. However, as a person, John is everything Ramsay wanted to be. Ramsay gets the image, the title of the Great Lord, but nothing more particularly. It is all a bit fraudulent, and even then this image seems destined to be temporary. I don't think Ramsay is going to live very long in the books. John may even play some hand in that happening. Having mentioned them at least briefly, I think it's finally time to discuss the downfall. The Red Wedding was always going to be a risk for the Boltons. People always seem to talk about how A Song of Ice and Fire is a story where the bad guys win, and a story that says only the most ruthless come out on top in the world, but that's just far too simplistic a conclusion to make, because ruthlessness can certainly be an advantage in the right circumstances. The most ruthless figures certainly are able to advance their power in this story, but can they consolidate it? The fact is, an increasing number of Northern Lords have strong grievances with the Boltons, and the Banner of King Stannis offers them an opportunity to do something about their grievances. Unless Stannis is actually dead in the books, but that seems unlikely just yet. Holding the wedding of Ramsay and fake Arya at Winterfell was meant to add to their claim, to assert their dominance over the north, as well as obviously holding it there for strategic reasons in terms of Stannis' advance. Instead though, Winterfell serves to embolden Theon's spirits and reminds the other lords of their loyalty. The Boltons and Freys become trapped in a castle full of supposed allies, but potential enemies, including one mysterious assassin who keeps murdering Boltons and Freys under the cover of darkness. The North remembers the Red Wedding and Lady Hornwood. All of these figures trapped in Winterfell together. It becomes a bit of a powder keg. Plus, psychologically, this is a pivotal time for Ramsay, because he kind of has everything he ever wanted now. He's Lord of Winterfell, not the son of a miller. He has become the thing he always hoped would earn him approval. So, where does he go from here? What does he do now that all the things he wanted haven't brought him happiness? I doubt we can read into the fact Ramsay kills his father in the show, but there might be grounds for that to happen now, with Ramsay established as true-born Lord of Winterfell, to realise he still has none of the approval and acceptance from Roose Bolton. You know, generally I've not discussed their relationship too much this video, which is principally because Ramsay doesn't even meet Roose until later into his life. I couldn't find any evidence for when exactly, but according to A Song of Ice and Fire wiki, Ramsay was born in or before the year 282, and Roose brought Ramsay to the Dreadfort after his son Domeric died in 297, which means Ramsay was at least 15 when he first met Roose. Or when he properly met Roose. What that means is Roose wasn't quite so influential in Ramsay's development as people tend to assume. However, we do still have a 15-year-old boy forever desperate to meet his father, and only getting to do so as a result of Domeric's death. And then when he does meet him, it's an incredibly cold father who wanted Domeric, who is either grieving his death, or at the very least blaming Ramsay for it. Regardless of whether rightly or wrongly, that's going to feel cold for Ramsay, and treating him also as an expendable pawn he has zero care for. Nothing Ramsay ever does changes that fact. His sadistic acts are probably in part an outlet for his frustration about this, especially where there is some warped idea of care or loyalty rolled into the way he treats his victims. I suppose the point I'm building towards is that some people look at Ramsay like a cartoonish villain. They see Roose as the darker, deeper terror, but Ramsay seems one-dimensional in his evil qualities. And personally, I look at all of this and I think, no, I don't see Ramsay as cartoonish. I think we have explored a level of depth here. I think there is a lot to him. But as opposed to all of these sort of masterful, scheming qualities that people sometimes do attribute to characters like Roose, with Ramsay, you just see him as pathetic. That's not quite the right word, but an impulsive boy who can never quite get what he wants, seeking approval and loyalty, but caught up in rage and malice, starved of all empathy, and then given near limitless freedom for his impulses. I think what's terrifying about Ramsay is precisely the fact there is no masterful, politically shrewd, greater scheme or depth at play here.
Your father is Lord Rickard Carstark. Lord Rickard Carstark is Robb Stark's bannerman. I betrayed Robb. That's why you're torturing me.
This isn't happening to you for a reason. Well, one reason. I enjoy it.
He is basically this man full of murderous rage and this hurricane, and when you give someone like that all these troops, a castle, a title, the banner of a flayed man, the vague idea of something to live up to within that, Ramsay then does all of the horrific things he does do. For me, the horror isn't in trying to understand why any of these things happen, although that is obviously a part of it, but the main horror is how they happen, how easily they all happen, how easily Ramsay is afforded the opportunities, and despite an attempt from Roderick to execute him, how easily Ramsay, or the Boltons as a whole, how easily their horror is tolerated, at least until the next book. In the midst of Ramsay getting everything he technically wanted, and being trapped in a powder keg of a situation, his wife and Reek abandon him. Not just a symbol of the rejection, or the lack of loyalty he has always been terrified of, but also threatening his tenuous grip on power even more. Ramsay is not someone good at regulating his emotions, and therefore his increasing stress makes him increasingly reckless and unpredictable. I don't particularly think he will kill Roose, but I could see that or something similarly reckless happening if Ramsay increasingly feels under pressure. Everything is poised for such a messy conclusion should George ever deliver it. You know, I've not thought too much about Roose yet, but for the moment, part of me looks on him as a man who's lost Domeric and his legitimate heirs, who knows he's getting old, and without really much fear, is just seeing how far he can rise before that end, unfazed and untethered by whether or not there's any legacy to pass on to Ramsay. If I am right about that, and I don't know, that's then another mark for reasons Ramsay is destined to fall. The power he has amassed is built on the shifting sands of a man not particularly concerned with consolidating it. Yeah, I think I've discussed most of the things from my notes now. Let me know what you think. What did I get wrong or not mention or could have expanded further? Did I do a good job? Like the video if so. I think it does genuinely seem to make a difference when people do. Subscribe also for more character analyses like this, or all of the other videos I make too. Maybe even support me on Patreon, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Luke Hoare, Treat Trukaba, Michael Gallagher, Flying Spider, Kellyanne Davidson, Billy Lee Myers Jr., Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell and Michael Hart. Thank you.